It was past midnight in New York City, the kind of late hour when the city's endless energy finally dipped into a hush. In a quiet corner of Brooklyn, a lone neon sign buzzed, "Open 24 hours" in scarlet letters outside a small retro diner. Inside, Grace Miller wiped down the long laminate counter with slow, methodical strokes. The diner was nearly empty now. Just a couple of regulars nursing coffees at a booth, and a solitary man at the far end of the counter, face partially obscured by the brim of a charcoal gray fedora. Grace stifled a yawn as she cleared away crumbs from an abandoned plate. She'd been on her feet for hours, and the fatigue weighed on her shoulders. At 26, working double shifts at Betty's diner wasn't how she'd imagined her life would be. But dreams and reality rarely aligned in this city. Rent was due in 2 days. Student loan bills loomed every month, and her part-time classes at the community college weren't going to pay for themselves. Still, she took pride in honest work and in making people feel welcome, even at an hour when the rest of the world slept. As Grace rinsed out the coffee pot, she let her gaze drift to the big front windows. A light rain pattered against the glass, turning the glow of distant street lamps and traffic signals into watery smears of color. The sidewalks outside were empty, with only an occasional car cruising by on the wet asphalt. This pocket of the city felt almost peaceful. Safe, even. "Hey, Gracie, you doing okay?" came a low, friendly voice from the kitchen pass-through. It was Joe, the diner's owner and nighttime cook, peering at her with concern. He was a grizzled man in his 60s, belly stretching his flannel shirt and a kind smile beneath his salt-and-pepper mustache. Grace offered him a tired but warm smile. "I'm fine, Joe. Just another late night." She placed the coffee pot back on its burner, the rich aroma of fresh brew momentarily masking the ever-present scent of frying oil. "Want me to lock up soon? It's dead out here." Joe glanced at the wall clock, 12:47 a.m. "Yeah, might as well start closing prep. No point staying open if no one's coming in." At this, the man at the counter looked up from under his hat. Grace hadn't paid him much attention beyond a quick exchange when he ordered black coffee about 20 minutes ago. Now she realized he hadn't touched the refill she'd given him. He sat unnaturally still, hands folded on the counter, the angle of his shoulders suggesting a coiled tension. He was striking, olive-skinned with a strong, stubbled jaw and eyes like cold steel beneath the brim of his hat. He radiated an aura of quiet power. He wore a tailored suit, though he'd shed the jacket which now lay folded on the stool beside him. The dark vest and crisp white shirt emphasized broad shoulders. He wasn't the typical late-night diner patron. In another life, she might have guessed he'd come from some gala or high-rolling casino. But here he was, alone past midnight, in a down-to-earth Brooklyn eatery. "In a minute," the man said softly, his voice low and calm, yet carrying an authority that belied the casual words. "I'm not quite finished with my coffee." Grace nodded, suddenly feeling a little self-conscious under his steady gaze. She wiped her damp hands on her apron. "No rush, sir. Take your time." The man inclined his head slightly in thanks, and returned to gazing down at his cup. Grace's heartbeat had quickened for a reason she couldn't name. There was something about him. He radiated a subtle menace alongside a quiet courtesy, a paradox that intrigued and unsettled her. Brushing off her nerves, Grace turned away to finish wiping down the other end of the counter. "Keep it together," she chided herself silently. "Only a bit longer, and then you can head home." She thought of her apartment a few blocks away, a tiny studio above a laundromat where the radiator hissed all night. Hardly a dream home, but it was. Hers, and with enough overtime, maybe someday she'd save enough to move somewhere better. That modest hope kept her going on nights like this. The bell above the diner's front door jangled suddenly, startling Grace. A trio of men shouldered their way in, bringing with them a gust of cool, damp air. They were rough-looking and loud, two of them laughing in a way that set Grace's nerves on edge. They wore leather jackets despite the mild night, and one had a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. Not the usual late-night truckers or shift workers she sometimes saw at this hour. Grace exchanged a quick glance with Joe through the kitchen window. He frowned, wiping his hands on a towel. Something about these new arrivals wasn't right. "Welcome in, guys," Grace said, forcing a polite smile as the men swaggered to a stop in the middle of the diner. They didn't take a seat, which was her first clue that they weren't here for the pie and coffee. "Sit anywhere you like. Can I get you something?" The man with the neck tattoo grinned at her, but there was no warmth in it. His two companions spread out slightly behind him, a subtle move that made Grace's stomach twist. They were positioning themselves, one near the door, one near the far end of the counter. The man at the counter, the one with the fedora, remained still, but Grace saw that his posture had changed almost imperceptibly. He had straightened, one hand sliding casually near his coffee mug, yet she sensed it was not the mug he was prepared to reach for. "Yes, sweetheart, we're looking for something real special," Neck Tattoo drawled, his accent a harsh New York dialect with an edge that hinted at trouble. His eyes slid over Grace, making her skin crawl, before shifting toward Joe, who had now stepped out from the kitchen, towel in hand. "We're looking for the owner. That you, Pops?" Joe swallowed hard but lifted his chin. "I own the place, yes. Is there a problem?" One of the other men, a bearded brute with arms as thick as hams, spoke up with a leer. "Depends. Word is you might be behind on certain payments." Grace's heart skipped. Payments? She knew immediately what they meant. There had been rumors whispering through the neighborhood, local shops and diners like this getting squeezed by some new gang. Protection money, extortion. Joe had always dismissed it, saying their neighborhood was under the watch of someone who kept troublemakers away. Grace had never asked who, and Joe didn't like to talk about it. But apparently trouble had found them anyway. Joe stepped forward, weathering the intimidating presence of the thugs with more courage than Grace felt. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly. "This is a lawful business. If you fellas are here for a meal, fine. If not, I'll have to ask you to leave." Neck Tattoo's grin vanished. He walked slowly up to the counter, resting both hands on the shiny surface as he glared at Joe. "Wrong answer. See? Mr. Ivankov doesn't like hearing no. Everyone in this area pays up, or they find themselves in a world of hurt. And I'd hate for anything to happen to this nice little establishment." His tone was mock sympathetic, but menace lurked beneath. Grace's mouth went dry. She moved to stand next to Joe, her instinct to support him overwhelming her fear. "Please," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "We're just a small diner. We barely make enough to cover costs. There must be a misunderstanding." Before she could finish, Neck Tattoo's hand lashed out and swept an empty coffee cup off the counter with a clatter, causing Grace to flinch. The ceramic shattered on the floor, and the sudden violence of the gesture made the remaining 2 late-night regulars in the booth jump to their feet. They bolted out the door without even asking for their check, the bell jingling madly behind them as they fled into the night. "It's a shame when people don't cooperate," the leader said, clucking his tongue as if disappointed. His eyes flickered past Grace to the man seated at the end of the counter, the one who had yet to move or speak. "And who's this? Another customer? Buddy, you should head on out. We're closed." The man in the fedora slowly lifted his head at being addressed, and Grace felt the air in the diner shift. Those gray eyes of his fixed on the thug with a steady, unblinking stare. "I haven't paid my check yet," he said, voice cool and composed. He reached into his vest pocket, and for a split second Grace's heart lurched, expecting him to pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a few folded bills and placed them calmly beside his untouched coffee cup. "Keep the change," he murmured to Grace without breaking eye contact with the intruders. Neck Tattoo snorted. "All right, you paid. Now beat it." He jabbed a thumb towards the door. The corner of the fedora-wearing man's mouth twitched slightly, as if amused, but he made no move to stand. Instead, he spoke softly. "You mentioned Ivankov. As in Sergei Ivankov, yes?" At the name, a flicker of surprise crossed the thug's face. "What's it to you?" he growled. Rather than answer directly, the man finally rose from his stool. Grace realized he was taller than he had appeared sitting down, well over 6 feet. He moved with a certain grace, controlled and unhurried, even as the tension ratcheted up. When he took off the fedora and set it on the counter, Grace saw his hair was slicked back, except for one unruly lock that fell across his brow. There was a thin scar just above his right eyebrow, a pale line that only added to the aura of danger now emanating from him. He adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves calmly. "Mr. Ivankov must be getting bold," he said, almost conversationally. "This neighborhood isn't his to claim." Neck Tattoo's eyes narrowed. The other two thugs exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unnerved that this stranger knew their boss's name and was speaking so confidently. "Who the hell are you?" the leader demanded. The stranger didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked to Grace and Joe, then back to the thug. "Someone who doesn't appreciate his friends being threatened," he replied, his tone turning hard as steel. "You and your men have until the count of 3 to leave." Grace's breath caught. Was he insane? 3 against 1, and these brutes were likely armed. She wanted to shout at him to stay out of it, that it wasn't worth his life, but fear constricted her throat. For a moment, the thugs were silent, processing the audacity of that ultimatum. Then the bearded goon by the door barked out a laugh. "This guy's got a death wish." Neck Tattoo sneered and stepped around the counter, putting himself uncomfortably close to Grace and Joe. She instinctively inched in front of Joe, trying to protect the older man, even as her knees threatened to buckle. The thug pulled back his jacket, revealing the black handle of a pistol tucked in his waistband. "You got a big mouth, pal," he hissed at the stranger. "How about I count to 3 and you—" Bang. The sound was so loud in the enclosed diner that Grace's ears rang. At first she thought Neck Tattoo had shot the stranger, but then she saw the thug stumble backward, eyes wide in shock, a red blossom spreading on his upper arm. The gun he'd been reaching for clattered to the floor. The fedora-wearing man had shot him. Grace hadn't even seen where the weapon came from, but it was now in the stranger's hand, aimed steadily at the intruders. A wisp of smoke curled from the barrel. Everything happened at once. "Gun!" Joe shouted unnecessarily, diving behind the counter. The thug by the door cursed and pulled out his own firearm, firing wildly. Grace yelped and dropped to the floor as 2 bullets shattered the display case of pies behind the counter, spraying glass and dessert everywhere. The third thug, momentarily frozen, fumbled to draw a knife from his boot, perhaps not wanting to risk a shot with his comrade in the line of fire. The stranger moved fast, faster than anyone Grace had ever seen. He ducked low and sidestepped behind a booth as more shots rang out, the pops and muzzle flashes terrifyingly bright in the dim diner. From her position crouched on the tiles, Grace peeked around the counter in time to see the tall stranger emerge at the end of the row of booths behind the shooter by the door. In one swift motion, he grabbed the man's gun arm and wrenched it upward. A deafening blast went into the ceiling. The stranger slammed the man's wrist against the back of a booth with a sickening crack, forcing him to drop the gun. The thug staggered, trying to swing his other fist. The stranger drove an elbow into the man's gut, then delivered a sharp kick to the chest that sent the thug crashing into a table, which collapsed under his weight. Neck Tattoo, clutching his bleeding arm, had retrieved his dropped pistol with his good hand. Face contorted in pain and rage, he was struggling to aim at the stranger without hitting his fallen friend. Grace's heart lurched. From where she crouched, she realized with horror that the thug's line of fire pointed directly toward the booth where the stranger was now standing, directly toward his back. Without giving herself time to think, Grace acted. She seized the first thing her fingers touched, a heavy glass sugar dispenser that had rolled off the counter during the chaos, and hurled it with all her might at the gunman. "Look out!" she screamed. The sugar jar struck Neck Tattoo in the side of the head just as he fired. His aim swung wide. The bullet meant for the stranger instead blew out the front window in an explosion of cracked glass and rainwater. The thug yelled in surprise, stumbling, and the stranger did not waste the moment. He pivoted and fired once. The sharp crack of his pistol made Grace flinch. Neck Tattoo's knees buckled and he crumpled to the floor, groaning and writhing. He'd been shot in the leg. The only one left was the knife-wielding thug, who up until now had hesitated to engage in the gunfight. But with his comrades down, desperation twisted his face. He rushed toward the stranger with a roar, blade raised. Grace's warning died on her lips. The stranger simply stepped aside at the last second, catching the knife-wielder's arm and redirecting his momentum straight into the countertop. The thug's forehead smacked the edge of the counter with a gruesome thud. He collapsed, the knife clattering away harmlessly, and then, as suddenly as it began, the diner fell quiet, save for the ragged breathing of the injured men and the ringing in Grace's ears. Grace realized she was still crouched on the floor, clutching her apron. Slowly, she rose on shaky legs, taking in the scene with wide eyes. The front window was a spiderweb of cracks, letting in a chilly drizzle of rain. The pies in the display were destroyed, filling splattered everywhere. One of the hanging lights swung precariously from a bullet-shredded chain, casting wild shadows. The stranger stood in the center of it all, chest heaving just a little. He still held his pistol, which he now trained on the only conscious thug, Neck Tattoo, who was slumped against a stool, cursing in Russian and pressing a hand to his bleeding thigh. Blood pooled darkly on the checkered floor tiles around him. Joe peeked out from behind the counter, eyes huge with shock. "Gracie, you okay?" he stammered. Grace found her voice after a moment. I think so," she managed. Her heart was pounding so violently she felt it might leap out of her throat. But aside from a few tiny cuts on her arms from flying glass, she was unharmed. The stranger looked Grace's way at the sound of her voice, concern flickering over his stern features. "Are you hurt?" he asked. And there was a gentleness in his tone that caught her off guard, given the ferocity she'd just witnessed from him. Grace shook her head quickly, her knees threatening to give out now that the adrenaline was ebbing. "I'm fine," she said, her voice still trembling. "Joe, are you okay?" Joe nodded as he stood up fully, though his legs wobbled. "Thanks to this fella, I reckon," he said, looking at the stranger with awe. "Hell of a shot." Before anyone could say more, the stranger strode over to Neck Tattoo and kicked the fallen thug's gun further away out of reach. The man spat a vile curse at him, which earned a swift, almost casual backhand to the jaw. The thug's head snapped to the side and he went quiet, cowed and clutching his face. The stranger crouched, grabbing the man by the collar of his jacket. "Tell Ivankov," he said in a low, dangerous voice that raised goosebumps on Grace's arms, "that he's made a very expensive mistake tonight." His gray eyes were flat and merciless. "This neighborhood is Romano territory. Romano." The name rang out with an authority that even Grace recognized. She didn't move, barely breathed. She had heard the name in passing, perhaps on the news or in whispered conversations. Romano, a family name tied to organized crime, if memory served. Could this man? Neck Tattoo evidently knew the name too, his bravado visibly withered. Sweat beaded on his brow, mixing with the blood from a cut on his temple. "Shit," he stammered, wincing. "We didn't know." "No," the stranger, Romano, interrupted coldly. "You didn't, but Ivankov did." He released the thug with a shove that made him groan. The man's initial cockiness was gone, replaced by fear as he realized whose presence he was in. Romano stood and pulled a sleek phone from his pocket. He pressed a single button. "Carlo," he said brusquely once someone picked up. "I'm at Betty's diner on 5th. We had an incident. 3 of Ivankov's men. Cleanup needed. Tony's been hit." He glanced toward one of the booths where, for the first time, Grace noticed another figure lying slumped against the torn vinyl seat. It was the stranger's companion, the quiet man who had been sitting in the far corner booth. In all the chaos, she'd forgotten him. The man, Tony, was down, a dark red stain spreading on his left side. He must have been shot in the initial crossfire. "Oh no," Grace's hand flew to her mouth. She started toward the injured man without thinking. He had helped fight off the attackers, she recalled dimly, until one of the first gunshots found its mark. Tony looked to be in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair, and a ruddy complexion that had gone ashen from blood loss. Dominic Romano snapped the phone shut after issuing terse instructions. He moved swiftly to his fallen comrade, kneeling and pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck to check his pulse. Dominic's jaw was tight, the corded muscles in his forearm flexing as he tore open the wounded man's shirt to inspect the bullet wound. Grace quickly joined him, glass crunching under her sneakers. She could see the entry wound just below Tony's ribcage, blood welling with each shallow breath the man took. He was unconscious but alive for now. "Mr. Romano," Grace said softly, adrenaline overriding her hesitation at using his name. "Let me help. I've taken some first aid classes." More than that, she thought, remembering long nights nursing her sick father years ago, but there wasn't time to explain. Dominic turned his steely eyes on her. Up close, splashes of someone else's blood speckled his white shirt and a bruise was forming on his cheek, yet he looked unfazed by his own pain. He gave a curt nod, shifting to make room. He was hit in the side. The bullet might still be in there. Grace nodded. "We need to slow the bleeding until an ambulance," she began, reaching to apply pressure, but Dominic cut her off. "No hospitals," he said sharply, then gentled his tone when he saw her startled expression. "I've called my own medics. They'll be here any minute and they'll be discreet." Grace understood. People like him didn't go to public hospitals. Not when gunshots were involved. They had private doctors, no questions asked. It was illegal, and under any other circumstances the thought would alarm her. But at this moment, all she cared about was stabilizing the wounded man. She grabbed a clean dish towel from a nearby table and folded it thickly. "Help me turn him slightly," she instructed. Dominic followed her lead without question, supporting Tony's weight as Grace pressed the cloth firmly against the wound. Tony moaned faintly but didn't wake. Grace's hands were slick with warm blood. She fought to keep her focus. "Joe, call 911, she called out on reflex, then remembered Dominic's warning about discretion. "Actually, Joe, don't. It might complicate things." From behind the counter, Joe had been watching with wide eyes, the wall phone's receiver already in his hand. He looked torn, then slowly set it down. He trusted Grace's judgment even if he didn't understand. Dominic's gaze lingered on Grace's face as she worked. "You're surprisingly calm," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Grace almost laughed at that, a shaky, adrenaline-laced sound. "Trust me, I'm terrified," she said, pressing harder on the wound as blood seeped through the towel. Her voice quavered despite her efforts to steady it. "But panic later, help now. That's what my dad always said." "Well, used to say," she caught herself. Her father had passed 2 years ago. Her vision blurred for a second, but she blinked the tears away. Dominic was silent for a beat, but something in his expression softened. Just a fraction. Together they knelt on the greasy diner floor, applying pressure and doing their best to keep Tony alive by sheer will until help arrived. It didn't take long. Less than 5 minutes later, headlights flashed through the shattered front window, and a black SUV screeched to a halt outside. 2 men in suits rushed in carrying a large medical bag. They moved with professional efficiency. One had the bearing of a trained paramedic as he took over from Grace. She relinquished her place, wiping her bloodied hands on her apron with a trembling sigh of relief as the medics began tending to Tony. Dominic stood and barked a few low orders to a couple of additional men who had arrived in the SUV, cleanup crew apparently, who immediately set about disarming the downed thugs and dragging them out the back door with rough efficiency. Joe approached tentatively. Before he could speak, Dominic clasped Joe's shoulder and promised to cover the damages, assuring him no one would bother his diner again. Joe nodded numbly, gratitude and shock written on his face. The medics soon had Tony on a stretcher and hustled him outside to the waiting vehicle. Dominic's shoulders sagged slightly once his injured man was in good hands. He turned to Grace. She stood amid the wreckage of the diner, looking pale and shaken and incredibly brave. Her apron and clothes were stained with blood, and glass shards glinted in her blonde hair. Dominic stepped toward her, concern etched in the hard lines of his face. "You should come with me," he said. It wasn't exactly a question, but his tone was surprisingly gentle. "It's not safe for you here now." Grace knew he was right. The police would arrive soon, drawn by the gunshots, and what could she possibly tell them? That a Mafia boss had just saved her life from a rival gang's thugs? Even if she tried, it would cause more trouble. For Joe, for herself. And Ivankov's men. If any of them had gotten away, or if there were others, she might still be a target for simply being here. A cold tendril of fear snaked up her spine at the thought. She looked around at the ruined diner, at Joe, who was anxiously shuffling to and fro with the cleaners, and at Dominic Romano, who stood patiently, as if waiting for her to process it all. He had just met her, yet he had fought for her, protected her. And now he was offering safety again, she supposed. Grace took a shaky breath. "Okay," she said softly. Relief flickered in Dominic's eyes. He nodded, and offered his hand to her in a gentlemanly gesture that felt oddly formal, given the blood and chaos surrounding them. Grace realized her own hands were still trembling. She quickly rinsed them under a trickle of unspilled water from the soda fountain sink, then stepped around the debris. She accepted his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and reassuringly solid. He guided her outside, keeping her close under his arm as they hurried to the SUV. The rain had lightened to a fine mist. Grace shivered, from cold and shock, and Dominic immediately shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was far too large and smelled of expensive cologne, with an underlying scent of smoke and gunpowder. Somehow it made her feel safer. The back seat door was already open. Dominic helped Grace in, then slid in beside her. As the door thumped shut, sealing them away from the shattered little diner that only minutes ago had been a haven, Grace felt a pang of unreality. How had her quiet shift exploded into this nightmare? Dominic's low voice broke through her whirl of thoughts. "I'm taking you somewhere secure. You'll be safe there." He spoke as if to a skittish animal, each word measured and calm. Grace just nodded. The exhaustion and shock were catching up to her. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking beneath the warmth of his jacket. Dominic noticed. He reached over, and after a brief hesitation, gently took one of her hands in both of his. The gesture was comforting, steadying, and it surprised them both. Grace saw him catch himself, this cold, composed Mafia boss, and she saw something human in his face, something like concern mingled with resolve. "It's all right now," he said quietly. "I won't let anyone hurt you." For reasons she couldn't begin to articulate, Grace believed him. The SUV sped through the wet streets. Grace leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. Everything had changed so fast. Less than an hour ago, she was a waitress finishing a shift. Now she was in the company of a dangerous man, fleeing a scene of violence, her life entangled with his whether she liked it or not. She swallowed hard and mustered a small, shaky voice. "Thank you, for what you did back there." Dominic's thumb unconsciously stroked the back of her hand. "You don't need to thank me," he murmured. "Those men were animals. They got what they deserved." After a beat, he added more softly, "You were incredibly brave, Grace." Grace managed a faint, fleeting smile. "I was terrified," she admitted. "You still acted," he countered, a note of admiration in his tone. "Most people wouldn't." Grace had no answer to that, so she fell silent, watching the city lights blur by through the rain-streaked window. Before long, the SUV pulled through a gate and into an underground garage. Grace realized she hadn't been paying attention to where they were going, but as Dominic helped her out of the car, she caught sight of a sleek lobby through a set of double doors. Wherever they were, it was certainly upscale. Dominic led her to a private elevator. A security guard in the garage nodded deferentially at him. They rode up in silence to the top floor. When the doors opened, Grace blinked in surprise. The elevator opened directly into a spacious penthouse living room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Dim amber light from modern wall sconces revealed elegant, minimalist decor. Steel and glass, dark hardwood floors, expensive abstract art on the walls. It was beautiful, but it felt more like a showplace than a home. Dominic let go of her hand, stepping aside a little uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure how close to be, now that the immediate danger was past. "This is one of my residences," he said by way of explanation. "You can stay here as long as necessary." Grace wandered a few steps in, her legs still wobbly. She gently laid his jacket over the back of a leather sofa. "Just how many residences do you have?" She attempted to joke, though her voice came out thin. He almost smiled. "Enough." Gesturing down a hall, he added, "There's a guest bedroom and bathroom prepared for you. I'll show you." He led her to a stylish guest suite that looked like a 5-star hotel room. King-size bed with a velvet headboard, a view of the city lights, a bathroom of marble and gold fixtures. Grace felt a bit dazed walking into it. Dominic flipped on a light. "There are fresh towels and... I'll have some clean clothes brought for you by morning." He glanced at her ruined uniform with a faint crease in his brow. "For now, there should be a robe in the bathroom you can change into." Suddenly, Grace became aware of how she must look. Drenched, stained with blood and pie filling, bits of glass still clinging to her hair. Her face heated. "Thank you," she murmured. An awkward pause stretched between them. Dominic cleared his throat. "I'll be right out here if you need anything. My men are downstairs and outside. You're completely safe here." He seemed to be reassuring himself as much as her. Grace nodded. I believe you." He turned to leave, then hesitated in the doorway. "Try to get some rest, Grace." The way he said her name, so soft and familiar, made her heart give a curious little twist. When he left, pulling the door halfway closed behind him, Grace stood alone in the opulent guest room for a moment, unsure what to do. The adrenaline of the night was ebbing, leaving exhaustion and a bone-deep ache in its wake. She peeled off her apron and ruined blouse, then stepped into the bathroom. Under the bright vanity lights, she caught sight of her reflection and winced. A bruise was blooming on her cheekbone where the thug had struck her with his gun, and a smear of dried blood streaked her temple. Not hers, she realized, Tony's. Her blonde hair was a tangled, clumped mess. With trembling fingers, Grace picked out a few tiny shards of glass from the strands and tossed them in the trash. In the mirror, her hazel eyes looked too large in her pale face, pupils still pinpricks of shock. She turned on the shower and let it run hot. Only once she was standing under the steaming spray did she finally feel the tears come. A few choked sobs escaped, lost in the hiss of water, as the night's terror washed over her anew, but she clamped a hand over her mouth, forcing herself to contain it. She didn't want Dominic or anyone hearing her breakdown. When she emerged from the shower, scalded pink and drained, she found the promised robe, plush white terry cloth, waiting on a hook. She wrapped herself in it and padded back into the bedroom, leaving damp footprints on the hardwood. On the nightstand, someone had thoughtfully placed a new toothbrush, toothpaste, a bottle of water, and a first aid kit. Grace managed a small smile at that and dabbed some antiseptic on the minor cuts on her arms. Outside the door, she heard low voices, Dominic speaking quietly, perhaps on the phone. She caught a few words. Yes, keep 2 on the lobby entrance. No one in or out. I'll handle things in the morning. Then his voice faded. Grace was bone-tired. The bed looked inviting, but her nerves were still humming. She decided to do something normal, mundane, something to ground herself. Picking up the hairbrush left on the dresser, she carefully worked it through her damp hair, counting each stroke. By the time the tangles were gone, her eyes were drooping. Gathering her courage, she opened the bedroom door. Dominic was seated on the long sofa in the living area, elbows on his knees, head bowed as he spoke softly into his phone. He glanced up immediately at the sound of the door. Ending the call, he stood, concern etched on his face. Grace realized she must look like a ghost in the oversized robe, face drawn. Sorry, she started to say, but Dominic crossed the room in a few swift strides. Are you all right? He asked. Up close, she saw he hadn't tended to himself at all. Dried blood, Tony's, spattered his white shirt, and one of his sleeves was torn, revealing a nasty scrape along his forearm. The bruise on his cheek had deepened to slate blue. Guilt tugged at her. He'd risked himself to protect her world, and here he was still focused on her well-being. I'm okay, she assured. Just couldn't sleep yet. Dominic nodded, then stood there, as if unsure what to do next. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken questions. Grace mustered a wry smile. Quite a night, huh? That earned a quiet huff of breath from him that might have been a laugh. Not exactly how I envisioned spending it, he replied. She found herself curious despite everything. Why were you there at the diner so late? If you don't mind me asking. He studied her for a moment, then answered honestly, I'd had a long day. Sometimes I drive with no destination just to clear my head. I stopped in for coffee, some quiet. I wasn't expecting company. His lips quirked. Certainly not expecting that kind of company. Grace toyed with the edge of her sleeve. I'm sorry my diner turned out to be ground zero for a turf war. Dominic's expression darkened. Never apologize for their actions. You have nothing to be sorry for, Grace. The fierceness in his voice surprised her. She nodded softly. Still, thank you for stepping in. I can't even imagine what would have happened if you hadn't. A muscle in his jaw ticked, and his eyes flickered with something like anger. Anger at the thought of what could have happened. Don't think about that, he said, almost growling the words. It didn't happen. You're safe. The room fell quiet. Grace realized she was staring at him, at the way his dark hair curled slightly now that it was drying, at the tension in his stance. He had killed tonight, more than once, she was certain. She had watched him become a force of nature to protect them. The rational part of her knew she should be afraid of him too. He was dangerous, a criminal, yet here, alone with him, she felt no fear. Instead, standing in the warm glow of his penthouse, wearing his robe and jacket and saved by his hand, Grace felt connected to him inextricably. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, drawing her attention to the streaks of gray at his temples she hadn't noticed before. He seemed to be waging some internal battle. Finally, he inhaled deeply and spoke, voice softer than she'd yet heard it. I need to go handle this mess with Ivankov's people in the morning. Tonight, you should rest. I promise. You're safe here. She had the sense he was about to retreat, to pull back into the polite, controlled shell of a host and leave her to the guest room. And maybe that was wise. But after everything, the thought of being alone, even in a luxurious room, made her chest tight. Before he could step away, Grace reached out and lightly touched his arm. Dominic. It was the first time she'd spoken his first name. He looked at her sharply, something undefinable flashing in his gray eyes at the sound of it. Grace's cheeks warmed. I don't really want to be alone right now, she admitted in a small voice. For a moment he didn't respond. Then, with infinite care, Dominic placed his hand over hers on his arm. Then you don't have to be, he said quietly. He led her over to the sofa and they sat down together. The city lights glittered beyond the vast windows, but the world felt far away. Grace drew her legs up under her, mindful to keep the robe tucked modestly, and Dominic settled at a respectful distance beside her, though he didn't let go of her hand. "I know this is a lot," he began gently. "Your life. You didn't ask for any of this." Grace let out a shaky laugh. "Definitely not how I thought my week would go." She sobered and looked at him earnestly. "What happens now with all of this?" She gestured vaguely, meaning the violence, the gangs, the fact that she was now wrapped up in it. Dominic's thumb absently caressed the back of her hand. Ivankov crossed a line. "He'll answer for it, but that's not your concern. I'll handle it." There was iron conviction in those words. He would handle it, and it would be bloody, she didn't doubt. "And me?" she asked softly. His grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "You'll stay here under my protection until I'm sure you're safe. No one will touch you, Grace, not on my life." Grace's heart thumped. The intensity behind that promise was almost frightening, yet it filled her with a warm sense of relief. "You barely know me," she whispered, voicing the thought that had been nagging her. "Why are you doing all this?" Dominic was silent for a long time, his eyes locked on their joined hands. She wondered if he'd answer at all. When he did, his voice was low. "I asked myself the same thing. I've wondered why I couldn't just walk away after the diner. I suppose I feel responsible. Those men targeted your diner because of a war I'm part of. You were hurt and frightened because of my world. I can't let that go." He paused, then added in a near whisper, "And you saved someone I care about. You stepped into the line of fire for Tony. I don't forget something like that." Grace blinked rapidly. No one had ever owed her a debt before. Certainly not a Mafia boss. "I only did what anyone would do," she said, flushing. He gave the barest shake of his head. "Not anyone, Grace. Very few, in fact." They sat in silence a moment, the air tinged with things left unsaid. Grace mustered her courage. I'm glad you were there tonight," she said quietly, peering up at him from beneath her lashes. "You saved my life." Dominic turned to her fully. His free hand hovered as if he wanted to touch her face but wasn't sure it'd be welcome. Eventually, he brushed a knuckle ever so lightly along the unbruised side of her cheek. "I'm glad I was there too," he said. The soft rasp of his voice sent a little shiver through her. Grace didn't know if it was adrenaline or something deeper making her heart pound faster. All she knew was that despite the insanity of the situation, she felt drawn to this man. She wanted to know why his eyes carried such sorrow when he thought no one was watching. Why a powerful crime lord would drive around alone at night to find peace. Why he, of all people, had been her savior. Dominic abruptly cleared his throat and withdrew his hand, perhaps realizing he was stroking her cheek. He looked away, suddenly all business. "You should get some sleep," he said, standing. "It's nearly morning." Grace stood too, her hand still caught in his. "Will you be here when I wake up?" The vulnerability in her own voice embarrassed her. But after the nightmare she'd been through, the thought of him gone scared her senseless. His eyes bore into hers. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until this is sorted and you're safe." He hesitated, then added, "I'll probably be up making some calls. But if you need me, I'll be right here." She believed him. Nodding, Grace allowed him to walk her back to the bedroom suite. At the door, they paused. "Good night, Dominic," she whispered. His gaze softened at the sound of his name on her lips. "Good night, Grace." It felt remarkably intimate. The simple act of wishing each other good night like old friends, or something more. Grace retreated into her room, closing the door softly. This time, when she crawled into the luxurious bed, she fell asleep within minutes, Dominic's quiet promise echoing in her mind. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly. Grace awoke to the unfamiliar hush of the penthouse. For a blissful moment, she didn't remember the previous night. Then a movement beyond her door brought it all back. She found a comfortable set of clothes, soft black leggings and a gray sweatshirt, folded on a chair with a note in neat handwriting. "Thought you might need these." Dee, even half asleep, she smiled. After washing up and dressing, Grace emerged hesitantly. The living area was empty, but a delicious smell wafted from the open-plan kitchen. There she found Dominic, of all things, cooking. He stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, deftly stirring something in a pan. He'd changed into fresh clothes, dark jeans and a black sweater that made him look more approachable, though no less striking. He glanced over and caught her staring. "Morning," he said almost shyly. I hope you're hungry." "I attempted omelets." Grace approached, noticing the lavish spread on the counter. Omelets, toast, fruit, and coffee. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since early the previous evening. "You did all this?" she asked in disbelief. Dominic gave a one-shouldered shrug. "It's the least I could do. Please sit." They settled at the small kitchen table. Grace took a tentative bite of the omelet. "Oh, wow. This is good." She looked at him in surprise. He chuckled softly. "Don't sound so shocked. I'm not completely hopeless." A pause, then more seriously. "How are you feeling?" Grace considered the question. Better. Bruised, but better. The events of the night before seemed almost surreal now, but her bruise and the ache in her muscles were proof it was real. Dominic nodded. "I'm glad. I have news, by the way." He sipped his coffee. "Ivankov's operation took a big hit last night. His men are scattered. He's in the wind, likely skipping town." Grace set down her fork, relief and apprehension mingling. "So it's over?" Dominic's eyes met hers. "For now. My people are keeping watch, but I doubt he'll try anything further, especially since I've solidified our territory lines this morning." He said it so casually, as if securing criminal territories was just another business task. Grace chewed her lip. "What does that mean for me?" Dominic exhaled, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "It means you're free, Grace. No more threat. You can go back to your life." He said it with an attempt at a smile, but she could hear something tight in his voice. Go back. To her tiny apartment and long hours and ordinary life. Was that what she wanted? It should have been an easy yes. And yet, she turned her hand over under his, threading her fingers through his. "What if I'm not sure I want everything to go back to how it was?" she said quietly, heart pounding at her own boldness. Dominic's eyes searched hers. "Grace," he began, his tone a gentle warning. She forged on, voice trembling but determined. "Maybe it's crazy, but what happened? It brought us together, and I can't pretend I don't—" She broke off, suddenly shy. Dominic rose and moved around the table, drawing her to her feet. He cupped her face with a gentleness that belied the strength in those hands. "You're not crazy," he murmured, eyes intense on hers. "Or if you are, then so am I." Grace's breath hitched. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "But I feel safe with you, and I shouldn't. I know your reputation, but—" "Shh." Dominic pressed a finger to her lips, then replaced it with his mouth in a tender kiss that sent warmth flooding through her. Grace melted against him, wrapping her arms around his neck. His kiss was unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world, a stark contrast to the frantic one they'd shared in the warehouse. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, Dominic smiled, a real heartfelt smile that transformed his face. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together," he promised. Grace smiled back, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "Together," she agreed. He pulled her into a tight embrace, and she let herself relish it. The solidness of him, the steady beat of his heart under her cheek. The storm that had swept into her life had passed. In its wake, oddly enough, was calm, a new path. Safe in Dominic's arms, Grace knew with certainty that her life would never be the same, and she found that she didn't mind at all. Whatever came next, they would face it together,